Okay. Well, okay. So the title, Bolshevik Path to Power, what I mean by that primarily is to look at first sort of their map of the active forces going on in the society that would sort of mapping out the revolutionary wave that they wanted to surf to power. And so and along with that, it's the tactics that arise from that map of the so-called active forces, which is a phrase that was often used. So I want to say right now that I'm going to spend a very little time refuting various standard stories, because I've, when I put out this material, there are some very understandable objections made, and I think they're good ones, but I have answered them. Anybody wants to look at this can look at this an online series that I wrote called All Power of the Soviets on John Riddell's site. So just Google Lars T, All Power of the Soviets, you can find it. So that will answer that question. But what is the main way in which my emphasis is different from many people who write today on the Russian Revolution? And I think it's this. I think it's that I am trying to look at the consensus and the continuity in the Bolshevik party and the Bolshevik message, as opposed to conflict and fundamental disputes. And and I will be emphasizing this, and that's what the Bolshevik path to power is going to be, both sort of a concrete. I'm going to make this concrete, I hope. And when I say continuity and consensus, I mean, first of all, between old Bolshevism or pre-war Bolshevism and 1917, between members of the leaders of the party and members of the party. That is to say, I'm going to emphasize on what united Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky, Stalin, and Lenin, not on what divided them. And I think what united them in 1917 was more important than what divided them. Also, I'm going to talk about the continuity and consistency of the message throughout the year. That is to say, I will maintain that March, people before Lenin showed up were saying the same essential message that that everybody was still saying in October. And finally, the larger picture, the same message, the same core goes through into the Civil War, and if he wanted to go into the beyond. So so that's my claim, that's my stakeout. And as I say, there are standard business bits of narrative and so forth that people will not understand, but I feel the time has come for me and for people to try to come out to a more positive thing without stopping at every moment to refute. Okay, so I'm also going to introduce you, people who listen to these talks before and are familiar with them, with three key words that I really feel that we all have to know. They're either Russian or based on Russian closely. They're new. They're not. They need explanation anyway. Although they were all basic terms in 1917. And my point will be that it's the interconnection between my three key words is what we're looking for, the core of the Bolshevik path to power. So the three words are narod, vlast, and agreementism. Okay, so narod, that means the people. And in the context of what we're talking about, it means essentially the workers and the peasants together. It also includes the lower classes in the cities, but they weren't playing as such a vital and political role as the other two. Okay, so that's the narod, and my maintain that in translations, when you see people, it doesn't have the same resonance. It doesn't. No, the narod was essentially, there was a big dividing line between it and elite society, or census society, or bourgeois society, or the bourgeoisie, or whatever you want to call that upper bit. there was a very strong division. So Narod versus the society. Secondly, Vlast, that's the same Vlast as means power. It's an all power of the Soviets, but it's also translated state, it's translated government, it's translated sovereignty, it's translated authority, and other things. So the centrality of this term and what it means is missed in translation. That's one of the reasons I feel we have to go back to the Russian. And and the central meaning of Vlast is, if I had to translate it, I would translate it as sovereign authority, inside a country, the one essential energizing last instance. So when you said all power of the Soviets, you were saying that the Soviets should have the last say, the final say, the sovereign say. And finally, agreementism, and well, that's in English, but it's a more direct translation of a keyword, soglashatelstva. It's hard to pronounce, but that's just an abusive term, soglashatelstva, based on a very common, ordinary Russian word, soglashenia, which means agreement. And unfortunately, again, we have a translation problem because, again, translators, and including the standard translators of the Lenin's works, not only have a trouble coming up with a good translation, but they use different ones, and you never know which one you're getting. And any reader who isn't looking for it, or even myself, because I'm often surprised, will not see the centrality of this issue. And that's one of the things I want to bring out: centrality of agreementism. So what essentially, it's very straightforward. What it means is whether or not the Soviet parties to carry out their program could rely on some sort of workable political agreement with bourgeois, quote unquote, or elite or census forces, and censitarian. And that was the key issue, as I'll try to explain throughout the year, and within the Soviet camp. And it essentially, the political history of the 1917 is that the Soviet constituency moved from agreementism to anti-agreementism. And later on, I'll quote something by what Lenin said. He said, "We knew we were ready to take power because anti-agreementism was now dominant in the Soviet constituency. So agreementism, the death of agreementism, and the ripeness, as it were, of Soviet power are equivalent. And as a matter of fact, to be anti-agreement and to say all power of the Soviets is almost logically equivalent." Okay, so especially the word all. So let's look at that word, the slogan, the famous slogan, all power of the Soviets, just a second. The word vlast, it's already one of my three key words. The word Sovietum in this context means the narod, it means the workers and the peasants. So it means the Soviets were, in this particular instance, the institution that represented them and only them. And then the word all power of the Soviets is anti-agreementism. It's saying you can't have any workable, political, stable agreement with the elite. So my three key words and all, the logic is brings out the basic message that I think was the Bolshevik path to power. Okay, so now I'm going to look briefly at the pre-war Bolshevism and the disputes. And I think the way to think of it is best is it's sort of asking. It's not some great theoretical insight. It's a empirical reading of Russian revolutionary dynamics after the 1905 revolution. Sorry, and best sort of comes out of the disputes among Russian social democrats about what lessons do we learn from the 1905 revolution. And the essential, so it was given the term hegemony. Unfortunately, that's a term that has a lot of meanings, a lot of overtones. Another term that they also use, and I think it's equivalent, is class leadership, rukovodstvo in Russian. And the central thing of this reading was the workers will lead the peasants, and that's possible in Russia at this time for this revolution because of a basic common interest. But it's both making a statement about the proletariat is able to be a leader, a class leader. It's organized enough. It has enough coherent program. It's dynamic enough, and the peasants are good followers or potentially good followers. They have demands, democratic demands, and demands for land that they're not socialists, but they're on the path of socialism, as it were. They will help you bring the next step. And then there's a third party to this scenario of active forces, and that's the liberal revolutionaries, anti-Tsarist revolutionaries. And these people will also like to lead the peasants. And so the basic idea here is that you shouldn't let them do that, and that it would be dangerous. And so the key task is to take leadership away from the peasants, from the liberals, of the peasants. So that's the basic idea. And I'm going to read some quotes from a strange, unexpected source here on bringing out this message, which is Alexander Bogdanoff, who was a Lenin lieutenant for several years, 1904, 1908 approximately, and then became an opposition within the Bolshevik party, the faction at the time, and was kicked out of the faction. And but when he was explaining his differences with he and his group, their differences with Lenin, they came out with a document saying, here is the consensus, here is the coherent part of the Bolsheviks that all we Bolsheviks agree with, and here's the part that's controversial. So I'm going to read from the part that people don't look at it very much because they're not interested in what unites Bogdanoff but I'm going to read from it because I think it consistently brings out very well the logic here. Okay, and I attach each of these three passages I'm going to read to All Power of the Soviets. So this first one is bringing out the logic of Sovietum, of to the Soviets, which is that the proletariat is in league with the peasantry. Okay, the Russian revolutionary movement can be carried out to the end and can bring to the country the greatest possible liberation of all its productive forces, only if the working class becomes the leader of the revolutionary struggle and it is supported by the mass movement of the impoverished land-hungry peasants. So the revolution can only really succeed if the proletariat is the leader of the peasants. By the way, this was written, I think, in 1909, 1910. Okay. The next one is the Antiagreementism and the All in the All Power of the Soviets. Quote, marching at the head of revolutionary democracy. Revolutionary democracy is another word for narod, for workers and peasants, the mass of which consists of the rural poor fighting to obtain land. The working class is compelled to fight against not only reactionary forces, Tsarist forces, but against the liberal bourgeoisie, who are only slightly disguised by a mask of democratism. In reality, the liberal bourgeoisie, the reformers, aspires to find an agreement, an agreement with the bureaucracy and the reactionary landowners in order to halt and crush the revolution as soon as it obtained for itself a share of economic and political power. So on the other side of the proletariat being the leader is that the liberals can't be the leader. And then finally, they've lost for full victory and completion of the democratic revolution. A militant and combined dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry is necessary. The working class must therefore actively participate through its representatives in local and central revolutionary provisional governments. Okay, so that is, I read that out to say that the entire Bolshevik party was behind this central set of propositions. Now, you probably noticed I said democratic revolution and so forth in there. So the question now arises, was this at all relevant to 1917, this map? And there's a large body of opinion that says no, that the issues were different. There's both, this is a sort of a standard story, both in academic professions and among many of the writers on the left, Trotskyist left. So I'm going to read a few, something I wrote about that very question. And I'll start off by quoting one of the most real pioneering historian of the Russian Revolution, academic Robert Daniels. And in The Conscience of the Revolution, which is like a classic in the field, he writes this: "The February Revolution caught the Bolsheviks completely off guard. The assumption of power by a conservative middle-class regime, seemingly supposedly impossible, made Lenin's doctrine of the, quote, democratic dictatorship, quote, meaningless. Events were proceeding more nearly according to Menshevik expectations." And here's a striking statement by Daniels: "During the interval between the February Revolution and Lenin's return, no group was more confused and disorganized than the Bolsheviks in Russia." So, this strategy, this tactics, this map of active forces seems, by Daniels' reading, to be not very useful. And of course, many Trotskyists say almost the same thing. After familiarizing myself with the relevant primary sources, I have a very different impression of the so-called clueless Bolsheviks. I think that I'm talking about Kamenev and Stalin, and sometimes I feel that the most controversial thing that I'm going to say is that Kamenev and Stalin weren't clueless. I say that they came back and they understood what needed to be done and where they were going, and it was all laid out in March. And I've done this. I know people will say that's impossible. I get that all the time. I have really got a lot of documents, new evidence. So that's got that. So let's first take the look at the Bolshevism in pre-war Russia. It was a leading member of the active forces in revolutionary Russia, and the tactics suggested by this map can be summed up in this way. This is the tactics now. The anti-Tsarist liberals will try to take over leadership of the revolution by obtaining support of the broad masses. Don't let this happen. The liberals will use their influence to make deals with Tsarism or whoever the reactionary forces of the time are, and thus stop the revolution halfway or 1/4 way. The only way to carry out the revolution to the end, to achieve essential revolutionary goals, and to transform Russia from top to bottom, is to institute a worker-peasant vlast. That is, a state power based on the road in which the party of the social proletariat provides the necessary political leadership. So, Kamenev and Stalin understood this. This was their political DNA. Indeed, they were among its most two of its most prolific spokesmen of this. If you look at their writings, Stalin's are available in English. Kamenev not so, but they should be. You'll get the logic of this very well. And what are the tactical guidelines implied in this reading of social forces in Russia? It certainly did not, contra Daniels, become meaningless in the post-February situation. On the contrary, they became more relevant than ever. The anti-Tsarist liberals were openly and explicitly trying to monopolize leadership of the revolution. They were openly and explicitly trying to ensure that it did not deepen or develop further. They were against the whole idea of deepening and developing the revolution. They wanted to stop it. The revolution's over. Now let's get back to work. The nationwide network of Soviets and worker and soldier, that's a stand-in for proletariat and peasant, was a ready-made vessel for a worker-peasant vlast. And in one essential particular, the pre-war Bolshevik strategy tactics was more applicable to 1917 than it had been earlier, and that is the war, because the war divided the narod and the elite in a way that made the clash between liberal and anti-agreementists even more meaningful and making the anti-agreements like to succeed. The whole idea of winning over the wavering masses of the people away from liberal and over to proletarian hegemony had been made much more doable by the war. Okay, so that it was applicable, and Kamenev and Stalin laid it out. And if you read what their writings and read it, all of them, and look at what's being said, you will see that they were against the imperialist war, that they didn't want to give any support to, they thought the provincial government was a bourgeois, that it was going to any day now become counter-revolutionary, and it was only a matter of time before everyone realized this, and that the only possible goal, the only goal with any perspective was a full Soviet blast, and that the Soviets, present Soviets, were the embryo blast. That was the metaphor they used, embryo blast. And they didn't want to have an uprising right then because, as everyone could see, they weren't ready. They weren't ready, if only because the majority of the Soviet constituency were not behind them, but for other organizational reasons as well. Okay, so what were their tactics? And I have a little list here of their action plan, which I'm going to read off. And this is all I can assure you all can be documented in the writings and documents of that period. 1, organize the parties, the Bolshevik party that is just now emerging from a highly repressive underground, since at present it's hardly able to hold and exercise and maintain power. 2, organize this Soviet system, both intensively, competent staff and support organizations for each Soviet, and extensively. Let's get a coordinated nationwide system of Soviets with central leadership institutions. And it's sometimes not taken in the significance of the fact that it was the moderate socialists, the agreement socialists, who set up the basic institutional framework for Soviet power, which is a national representative body. 3, win over support from the mass Soviets constituency, who have just now crashed their way into the political arena, into a political arena that it's entirely new to them, even if winning this support means the Bolshevik had to move out of their own comfort zone of advanced workers. And what I mean by that is that the Bolsheviks, like as an underground party, only had access to really committed people. But now they had to talk to everybody, and they had to learn how to do it. It was something new to them as well as to everybody else. 4 am I at now? Win over soldier support that is vital not only for the defense of the revolution, but also as a link to the peasantry. 6, wait until broad support by, quote, the provinces was assured. That is to say, this is all Russia we're talking about, not just Petrograd. 7, is that where I am? Coordinate with the already ongoing efforts by local Soviets to take over governmental functions in response to the rapidly accelerating social and economic crisis. 8, I don't have, move from earlier empty slogans like "down with the war" to more pragmatically useful agitational slogans such as "publish the secret treaties," "open peace negotiations instantly," so forth. And along with that, launch wide-ranging agitation campaigns around these concrete slogans. And the point of this was to make demands on the government that they would not be able to fulfill, and then that would show everybody the need for Soviet power. Because here's what we need: we demand the provisional government do it. They don't do it, so Soviet power is indicated. And finally, draw a sharp line between separating the Bolsheviks from the other agreementist socialists, who assure the Soviet constituency that revolutionary goals are attainable through some sort of agreement. Okay, so that was their strategy. And I'm going to say just a couple of words about the April thesis. One is, I'm going to tell you what I consider the most important thing to know about the April thesis. First, it's split into 2 parts. One part is what I call the negotiable part, and one's the non-negotiable part. The non-negotiable part is this core message. The non-negotiable part, which is essentially the first four of the theses, is no support for the provisional government, war is an imperialist war, no support for defensism, and Soviet power, and support for the peasants. So peasant revolutionary movement. So that's the core non-negotiable part of the Bolshevik things, and then there's a bunch of other stuff in there, like change the name of the party, or the Soviets are a higher type of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And those are negotiable. That is to say, you can stress those or not stress those. You can agree, you can disagree, and it will take a while for it. Lenin believed in them strongly, but he would take a while for him to convince everybody. Okay, so the essential thing is that the core part, the non-negotiable part, was not controversial. And I have looked at the debates, and I can say this for certain. And what you can, that is to say, people had all sorts of problems with the theses. What do you mean by this, Lenin? Or are you sure about that? Or you're telling me what? No police. What are you talking about? But no one said, "Hey, Lenin, you can't call the war imperialist. No, that's so pre-February. No." And no one said, "Lay off the provisional government. They're okay. They're nice guys." Milyukov, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Guchkov, Minister of War. Well, yeah, they may have been rabid imperialists back in the day, but they will now assuredly carry out a radical peace program if we just ask it nicely. No one argued that. No one argued that that putting pressure on a provisional government would get these characters to do a peace program. No one said, "Don't be so mean to the revolutionary defensists," such as Tseretelli and so forth, and so forth and so on. That is to say, if you look at the debates, nobody was, and it's, of course they weren't saying that, because they had been saying the same things themselves. They had been saying, the provisional government is counter-revolutionary, the war is imperialist, and we have to try for Soviet power. Okay, that's one reason why I think that the so-called big dispute over the April thesis got over so quickly. The essential core was not controversial. It stayed there, and it was there. I want to say just a few words now about how agreementism is the central issue, and define the party dynamics of what was going on. Because, well, first of all, it was the central divisive issue within the Soviet camp. Okay, and in order to understand that, you have to think of what was not divisive, and there was two things that were not divisive that everybody shared. I call this the Unwritten Constitution. Namely, there was a Soviet program, and I'm going to go into detail about that, but the basic prongs of which were not controversial. Land of the peasants, democratic peace, democratization of the army, so forth, and very heavy economic regulation, state economic regulation. What also was not controversial was the idea that the Soviets had the right to insist that this program be put into practice. And all the socialists in the leaders were telling the socialists, the Soviet constituency, telling the delegates to the conferences, telling the workers and the people and the soldiers in the garrison, saying, you have the right to have this program carried out. That's what the famous, insofar as really says. It says, if the government doesn't carry out this program, you have the right to remove it and put in another. Okay, so where did they disagree? What was the big disagreement? It was on how to carry out that program. Can you do it with an agreement, by working together in some way, with an agreement with the Liberal Party, the Cadet Party, the Constitutional Democrats, and the other sort of liberal people in the government, or do you have to throw them all out? You have no agreement whatsoever. And essentially, if you could carry out that program with an agreement, then it would be much better. You'd avoid civil war. It'd probably be a lot peacefuler. You could get the use of their expertise. But the Bolsheviks said, yeah, that's all very good, but it just won't work. It just won't happen. And that's the split. The split is how to accomplish the Soviet program through agreement or non-agreement. Okay, so that was an issue that you had to be either this one or this side or this side. You couldn't evade the choice for long. There's some people who said, oh, we're all social democrats together. So, but eventually you had to choose. So there's three basic parties, three large parties in the Soviet camp: the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and the Socialist Revolutionaries, or SRs. And the essential fact about the dynamics of the Russian Revolution during the year is that the Bolsheviks were agreed on anti-agreementism. The agreementism issue did not split the Bolsheviks in any way, whereas the other two parties were split right down the middle by agreementism, by that issue. That is to say, they were they were officially agreementists, but there were large minorities that were anti-agreementists. So the way I put it is, all Bolsheviks were agreementists, but not all Bolsheviks were anti-agreementists, but not all anti-agreementists were Bolsheviks. There were plenty of anti-agreementists in the other party, to name Martov in the Mensheviks, and Spiridonova and Kamkov and other people on the SRs. So those two parties split apart and destroyed their own political effectiveness because of this split. My little way of putting it is that the Mensheviks imploded and the SRs exploded. And what I mean by that is simply the SR split right on the eve of October into SRs and left SRs, as I'm sure you all know. And also the Mensheviks were torn apart and reduced to, they were almost the ruling party in February and March. And by September, they were nothing. They had reduced themselves to rubble. And so why is that? And essentially it's because of this, their effectiveness was ruined by this internal thing. And it's a very eloquent article. You can find it on Francis King's wonderful site of documents, internet site, by a Menshevik writer writing in fall 17, I think September. And I read just a couple of his eloquent things about how the Bolshevik Menshevik party destroyed itself over agreementism. He said, Menshevism fell in the political struggle. It disintegrated before it fell. It disintegrated from within. From the very beginning of the revolution, it lost its face, the individuality which must be a feature of any political party. One wing of it attached itself to the SRs and agreementism, and the other to the Bolsheviks and anti-agreementism, but they wouldn't organizationally join them, and they kept trying to argue with each other. There's never been a united Menshevik front throughout the entire period of the revolution. There was not one official statement or step taken by the Mensheviks which was not publicly repudiated by the Mensheviks themselves. The Mensheviks internationalists won for themselves an almost independent political existence, openly refused to subordinate themselves to all party decisions, operated as an independent faction, published their own papers. And and he said they were trying to convert people, and they did convert them, but then they went over to the Bolsheviks, because he said you can't spend all your time talking about how disastrous the policies of Menshevik leaders such as Tsereteli, Fyodor Dan, and other people. You can't expose them all the time as the agreementists they are, and expect people to vote for the party. So as nothing like this with the Bolsheviks, and that's one reason why we have to try to find out what united the Bolsheviks. And the way I put it sometimes is that Lenin was a strong leader of a united party, but it wasn't a united party because he personally, Lenin, was a strong leader. He was a strong leader because it was a united party, because owing in large part to his leadership over the last decade, the party as a whole understood the logic of anti-agreementism and was united around it. Okay. Okay, I'm getting close to time, so I'm going to I want to talk. There's an article that I. By the way, I should say that there were disputes. There were disputes within the Bolshevik Party. Of course, there were disputes about tactics and about whether to call a demonstration, or what to do about the July days, what to do this, what to do that. There were important disputes, but they were not about the core issue, and they were not about the core goal of Soviet power, exclusive Soviet power, and a worker peasant class. Okay, I will finish up by looking just to look at a particular document that I knew from before, but read over when I was preparing this talk. It said, this makes my points very well. It's a short article by Lenin in late September. It's called Tasks of the Revolution. You can easily find it on MI and on the Marxist Internet Archive. And I think I'm going to try to give to spruce up a copy, because my 3 keywords are all in there, but the English translation that's available doesn't allow you to see this very well. And the point of this article, called Tasks of the Revolution, was to set out, this is what Lenin said he was doing, to set out the basic Bolshevik program, to set out, said it's sort of, this is what he says, this is what we have to bring to the, not only our own supporters, not only to the workers, but to the peasants and to the lower middle class in the towns and everything. This is the soldiers. This is our message. Okay, so and I think therefore it's very, very revealing as to, I mean, here he is saying, here is our basic message. So what is it? And when you're reading it, you have to take one bit of context into account. Namely, it's at a time when he still thought, or at least said he thought, that peaceful development of the revolution was possible, i.e., all the socialist leaders, including the Agreementists, would see the necessity for full Soviet power, and if they did that, then there would be, agreement. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I mean, there would be a real unity of socialists, and that would be a good thing. Everyone would agree that if you could agree on full Soviet power. And so if you read this, you will not see any mention of the Second Congress, because that hadn't really got rolling, and you won't see any talk about armed uprising, which just about this time Lenin started saying was necessary. But that doesn't mean anything to do with the message it's bringing out. So the first thing about this little message that I think is revealing is what's not there. There's no mention of socialism or socialist revolution at all. It's just not there. Secondly, there's no mention of the Soviets as a higher type of, of democracy, proletarian democracy versus bourgeois democracy, and so the sort of state and revolution angle. So, interestingly enough, here's Lenin doing a message, and the two of the things that we most associate with the Bolshevik message in 1917 aren't there. What is there? Well, first of all, there's the basic idea of a hegemony, or the class leadership scenario that I talked about, namely that it's the job of the socialist proletariat to win over the narod, the peasants in particular. So he starts off by saying Russia is a country of the petty bourgeoisie, sort of a Marxist word for peasants mainly, by far the greater part of the population belonging to this class. They are vacillating between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We've got to win over their leadership, and only it has to be persuaded that only when it joins the proletariat, i.e. accepts proletarian class leadership, is the victory of the revolution, of the cause of peace, freedom, and land for the working people assured. And furthermore, the narod, the poverty, the masses, whatever word we want to use, are learning more and more through the experience of the year that agreementism doesn't work. Okay, so what are they learning? They're learning something over the year. They're learning that agreementism doesn't work, and that's the central message of this whole article: is agreementism is disastrous. So that's the essential thing. Essential thing is not any particular aim, or I mean, those are important, as we'll see. I'll list them, but the essential thing is you can't accomplish them with agreementism. And that's why Lenin said that if you reject agreementism, if you realize the Bolsheviks were right that it can't work, then you have to go for full Soviet power. Okay, so then other thing, I'm going to go through the sections where he talks about what the main goals, and in each case, he sort of documents what he's saying by quoting agreementist socialists, official socialist Soviet sources of the time, to make the point that we all want this. They've more or less promised that they're going to give it to you, but that's not happening. Okay, so section 1 is called Agreementism with the capitalists is disastrous. And among other things, it will lead to, we can't fight the war, can't even fight the war. And this is what I call anti-agreementist defensism, you know. He says here, the agreementism is leading to, it will lead to a military catastrophe, since the army hates the general staff and cannot enthusiastically participate in the imperialist war. That is to say, the front's going to break down, and the only way to stop this is to have a Soviet government that can get the army working again. And that's one reason, by the way, in the arguments among Bolsheviks about why they should take power right away, was that the front would disintegrate unless they did it. And so the first paragraph says agreementism is disastrous. The second paragraph says therefore all power to the Soviets. So that's the basic logic. Then next is peace to the peoples. Okay, democratic peace. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I want to make the point that the democratic peace, if you look at the material from March, the first two items of the Second Congress, when the new Bolshevik government, was to call for peace negotiations and to publish the secret treaties. Both those were on the table and put forward by Bolsheviks in March. Then land to those who till it. We support the peasants. And again, he says we should. It's their program. It's their program we want. We're not proposing any program on the peasants. This is their program, but they won't be able to accomplish it with agreementism. Same struggle against famine and economic ruin. Okay, this is the part where we get to state regulation and moving a bit towards socialism. But he doesn't mention that angle of it at all. He just says there's a crisis going on. Everybody knows what to do. Again, he quotes the people on the agreement of socialists as saying, here's what needs to be done, and but the government isn't doing it. And he says, okay, if they're not doing it, he says this admission on the part of the ruling parties, i.e., the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, proves once more the criminal nature of the policy of agreementism with the bourgeoisie. That's the bottom line at each of these things. Struggle against the counter-revolution. Again, you know, it's straightforward. We can't accomplish even the most basic goal, namely protect ourselves from the counter-revolution with agreementism going on. And finally ends up with peaceful development of the revolution, which he says, if you guys would now, if you agreement of socialists would just wake up and take over. We have one last chance at peaceful development. Of course, it didn't happen and probably couldn't have happened. But the point is that what Lenin is saying here is there is an unwritten constitution that says if the Soviets are united, they can declare, they can establish the government. So if we among ourselves decide that Soviet power is needed, that's it. It'll happen. And so the argument, so that finishes up. You know, he at each point he is saying there's a Soviet program. We have the right and the duty to see that it's done, but it can't be done with agreementism, and therefore full Soviet power. So after that, they got into an argument about the armed uprising and the Second Congress and all this sort of thing. And those are very dramatic, very, very, very important debates. But they are debates about how, given the political situation at the time, how to move from how to accomplish this goal that we've been talking about forever, namely full Soviet power and rejection of agreementism. And of course, by September, early September, the Soviets in the two capital cities were Bolshevik majorities, and so it was a matter, as one Bolshevik put it, of formalizing, of taking the unofficial last that was already in existence and making it the official last, or as in my language, taking the unwritten constitution and making it the written constitution. Okay, if I had hours and hours of time, I'd go into the debates among the Bolsheviks, but I think the essential point I wanted to make is here. The Bolsheviks had a path to power in that they had a map that they had worked out a long time ago. It was applicable to 1917. They had they from the very beginning, they applied it, they understood it, they pulled out the lessons. Lenin was right on board with this. And of course, he was the major person responsible for working out the logic in the first place. And it can stay consistent throughout. And at the very end, when they were arguing, let's go and have a genuine, now is the time to institute full Soviet power. The message was still on beam. And if we were to go further, it was still going on in the Civil War, where the idea of whatever we do, we have to keep the peasants on board. It's a worker peasant revolution. Democratic, socialist, you can argue about that, but what you can't argue about is it's a worker peasant revolution. And that sort of ends my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. That's very interesting. So the task